The tray clipped her elbow. That was all it took. 3 drops of red wine, no bigger than a fingernail, landed on the hem of an emerald silk dress, and Dahlia Hartwell said she was sorry before the glass had even stopped moving. She was 27. The only person in that entire house still wearing her work clothes, a gray blouse and a black skirt, her employee badge still hanging from her neck. She wasn't a guest at the Corsetti engagement party. She'd come to deliver a contract, and she was already halfway to the far door when it happened. Priscilla Rothway looked down at her dress. Then she looked up. 31 years old, a banker's daughter, pearls at her throat, a woman who'd never once in her life been told no. She didn't shout. That's the part people always leave out when they tell this story. She didn't say a single word first. Her jaw tightened, her eyes went somewhere cold, and then her hand came up, and the sound of it cracked across that dining room like something breaking. Delia caught herself on the edge of the sideboard, one hand rising to her face, the other still holding the folder she hadn't let go of. Somewhere near the windows, a wine glass slipped out of somebody's fingers and shattered on the marble. And then nothing. 40 of the most powerful people in Rhode Island were standing in that room, and not one of them made a sound, because every last one of them had just realized who was in the doorway. Ansel Corsetti hadn't been there 10 seconds. He still had his coat on. He still had his phone in his hand, halfway through a message he'd never finished sending. He was 34, and everything that moved through the port of Providence moved because he allowed it to. Men who'd known his father crossed the street rather than shake his hand. And he was looking at the woman he was supposed to marry in 6 weeks, her hand still in the air, and he wasn't moving at all. Priscilla saw his face, and something in her went pale underneath all that confidence. "Ansel," she started. She never finished it, because he crossed that floor without a word, bent down, picked up the napkin that had fallen at Delia Hartwell's feet, and handed it back to her like she was the only person in the building who mattered. Then he straightened up, turned around, and said one sentence. It wasn't loud. Half that room barely caught it, but the people who did catch it went white. And from that night on, not one of them has ever repeated it out loud. If this story moves you, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps us reach more folks who need to hear it. Share it with someone who's ever been treated like they were invisible. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we tell stories like this every single week. Now let's go back to that dining room in Barrington, to the second right before Ansel Corsetti opened his mouth. Because everything that follows starts with one sentence. He didn't raise his voice. That was what made the room more afraid than any shout ever could. Ansel spoke so softly that the people standing at the far end of the room had to lean forward to hear him. And it was that leaning forward that made the moment frightening, because all 40 people at that party were trying to catch every word of a sentence they already knew they would remember for the rest of their lives. He told Priscilla to bend down and pick up the pieces of the shattered glass, then apologized to the woman she had just raised her hand against, and to do both before anyone had time to pour another glass of wine, because if she didn't, she would leave this house tonight with exactly what she had brought with her. Not one thread more. Someone cleared their throat. Someone set a glass down on the table and seemed to forget where they had just placed it. Priscilla stood perfectly still for one very long moment, and then she laughed, a short, dry laugh, the kind of laugh that came from someone who had never been forced to learn how to lose. She asked him whether he truly intended to humiliate her in front of the entire city over some paperwork girl. The phrase fell into the dining room with more weight than the sound of the shattered glass had moments earlier. Delia remained exactly where she was, the file folder held against her chest, and she didn't look up. She had learned a long time ago that when people called you names like that, looking up never helped anything. Ansel turned his head toward Priscilla, and this time his voice was even quieter. He told her that the woman she had just called a paperwork girl was the person who held his signature, the only person in his organization permitted to carry documents that, if they fell into the wrong hands, could change ownership of the entire harbor outside by morning. Then he continued, and this was the sentence that drained the color from the faces of those who heard it. He told her that Delia had protected those papers for years without losing a single page, while she, in less than a minute, had shown him everything she was capable of holding on to. No one in the room dared breathe too loudly. Everett Rothway stood by the window, still holding a glass of wine he hadn't taken a single sip from, and he was the first to understand that the deal the two families had spent season after season negotiating had just died on that marble floor. Priscilla didn't pick up a single shard of glass. She didn't apologize either. She looked at Ansel for another moment, as though she were still waiting for him to take back what he had said. And when she understood that he wasn't going to, she picked up the purse resting on the table, turned on her heel, and walked straight out through the front door without looking at anyone. The sound of her shoes was the only sound in the entire house. Her father followed a step behind, and when he passed Ansel, he stopped for exactly half a second, said nothing, only looked at him, then kept walking. What followed was a very strange kind of retreat. No one said goodbye. No one shook the host's hand. 40 of the most powerful people in the state of Rhode Island collected their coats one by one and left. And they left the way people leave a funeral when they didn't know the person who died. Margot Doyle, the housekeeper who had worked in that home longer than Delia had been alive, stood tucked beside the kitchen door and didn't dare come out to clean until the final guest had disappeared from sight. Ansel didn't see anyone out. He turned back to Delia and asked whether she needed someone to drive her home. She shook her head and said the contract still needed his signature before 9 o'clock the next morning, and if he signed it now, she could send it out that night. He looked at her a little longer than necessary, then picked up the pen. He signed exactly where she pointed, without reading a single line again, and that was what made Delia turn her face away for a moment, because in that entire dark house that night, the simple fact that he didn't need to read it again was the only kindness she didn't know how to receive. She said thank you. She wished him a good night. Then she left the house through the servants' entrance, because that was the door she had come in through. The bus stop was a long walk from the gates of the Corsetti estate, along the road that followed the edge of the bay, and Delia walked the whole distance with the file folder pressed to her chest, as though she were afraid the wind might tear it from her hands. The September night over the water smelled of salt. She didn't cry. She only kept walking. And what filled her mind wasn't what had just happened in the dining room, but a very specific calculation. How she would pay the hospital bills next month if she lost this job. The bus arrived late. She climbed aboard, sat in the very last row, placed the file folder on her lap, and kept both hands resting on it for the entire ride home. The apartment in Pawtucket was on the 3rd floor of an old building with no elevator, and Delia had grown used to counting every step in the dark because the light bulb on the halfway landing had burned out back in the spring, and the landlord still hadn't replaced it. She opened the door as quietly as she could, set the file folder on the dining table, then went straight into the kitchen without taking off her shoes. There was half a serving of chicken soup left in the refrigerator from what she had cooked the afternoon before. She turned on the stove, poured the soup into a pot, stirred it slowly, and while she waited for it to warm, she stood looking at the wall above the sink, where an old brass employee badge hung, its surface dulled with age. Walter Hartwell's name was engraved on it, along with his crew number. She never polished it. She never told anyone why it hung there either, directly above the sink, in the one place where she had to stand in front of it at least twice every day. Junie called from the other room and asked if that was her. Delia said it was, then carried the bowl of soup inside. Junie was 19 years old, sitting with her back against the wall, her legs resting on a folded blanket, the book on her lap still open to the same page she hadn't managed to turn for the past several days. Today had been one of her hospital days, and Delia knew that on days like this, Junie could barely eat, so she had filled the bowl only halfway. Junie took it, thanked her, managed a few spoonfuls, then set it down and looked at Delia with the expression of someone who had just realized something was wrong, but didn't yet know what to call it. She asked how the contract handoff had gone. Delia said it had gone fine. They had signed it, and once she sent it out in the morning, it would be done. Junie asked again, more softly this time, whether something had happened there. Delia said no. It was only that parties meant crowds, and she wasn't used to being around that many people. Junie was quiet for a while. Then she said that when she was little, every time something hurt, Delia would tell her it was all right, then turn away and go do something else, and it had taken her many years to understand that turning away didn't mean everything was all right. Delia didn't answer. Junie asked her the question Delia would remember for a very long time afterward. She asked whether Delia ever got tired of having to be the strong one. Not tired from work, not tired from money, but tired from having to be strong for both of them, day after day, even on the days when no one was asking her to be. Delia stood up, picked up the bowl with the remaining soup, and said she'd heat it again so it would be warm. She went back into the kitchen. She stood there for a long time in front of the pot that had already gone cold, one hand gripping the edge of the sink, her eyes fixed somewhere on the wall ahead, right where the brass badge hung. She didn't turn the stove on. When she went back inside, she told Junie to get some sleep because she had to wake up early tomorrow, and Junie understood that the question she'd asked wasn't going to get an answer that night, so she only nodded, pulled the blanket higher, and wished her sister good night. Delia turned off the light in the bedroom, pulled the door nearly closed, then went back to the dining table and opened her laptop. The contract should have been sent out earlier that evening, and now she still had to review every appendix because the signature was there, but she hadn't finished checking the figures against one another. She worked beneath the light of a single desk lamp, both hands resting on the keyboard, and she noticed that they were still trembling slightly. She didn't think about the dining room in Barrington. She didn't allow herself to think about it. Instead, she thought about next month's hospital bill, about the follow-up appointment the hospital had already postponed twice, and about where she would even begin looking for another job if what had happened tonight cost her this one. By the time she finally sent the file, she could hear the garbage truck passing outside the window. She closed the laptop, sat still for a while in the darkness, then stood and crossed through the kitchen on her way to her room. As she passed the sink, she stopped. She lifted one hand and touched the brass badge once, very quickly, the way someone reaches for a stair rail after missing a step. Then she went to bed. The Rothway financial letter withdrawing its guarantee arrived before the sky was fully light, delivered through attorneys, exactly 3 lines long, polite enough to feel merciless. $400 million in guarantees for the harbor project vanished in those 3 lines, and by 8 o'clock that morning, everyone in the Corsetti Group building knew. People moved quietly. No one spoke loudly in the hallways. Ansel didn't mention the letter once. He kept his morning schedule exactly as it was, and the first person to step into his office was a subcontractor named Warren Nix, who had handled the reinforcement work on the pier surface for the past 3 seasons. Warren came in wearing the expression of a man who believed today would be a good day to ask for more work, because he had heard about the financing withdrawal too, and assumed that a corporation desperate for money would be easier to negotiate with. Ansel invited him to sit down, poured him coffee, and asked about his son studying in Boston. Warren smiled and said his son was about to graduate. Ansel nodded and said that was good. Then he pushed a stack of papers across the desk. Warren looked down, and Ansel said nothing else, giving him time to turn the pages. It was a reconciliation of the amount of concrete actually received against the amount that had been paid for, stretching across 3 seasons. And in the discrepancy column there were figures circled in pencil. Warren stopped turning pages when he reached the second sheet. Ansel said his father had lived by a rule, and that rule was never to touch another man's family, no matter what that man had done, because his father believed a man should pay only for his own actions. He went on to say that he still kept his father's rule, and Warren could rest assured that his son in Boston would finish his final year without anyone knocking on his door. Warren looked up, and perhaps for a fraction of a second, he thought he had escaped. Then Ansel told him the rest. He said that alongside his father's rule, he had a rule of his own, and his rule was that everything passing through this harbor had to pass through the proper door. He gave Warren 7 days to repay the difference, with no interest and no penalty, and after 7 days, the papers lying on the desk would go where they should have gone from the beginning. He didn't threaten him. He didn't mention anything that might happen to Warren Nix. He spoke only about the papers, and the papers lay there without moving. Warren stood, muttered something too softly to make out, walked to the door, and turned the knob. The knob didn't move. He tried again, his hand shaking so badly that it slipped off the metal, and only on the 3rd attempt did the door open. Ansel didn't watch him leave. He had already picked up the next file before Warren reached the hallway. That same morning, a local newspaper published a secretly taken photograph of Delia Hartwell at the party, along with a headline hinting at the private life of the man who headed Corsetti Group. By nearly noon, the 3 largest businesses in the harbor district had simultaneously canceled their advertising contracts with the paper. And by early afternoon, the bank called to announce that it was recalling the loan the newspaper had used to purchase its headquarters 2 years earlier. No one had a hair on their head touched. Not a single threat was spoken. The editor-in-chief called Ansel's office 4 times that day and wasn't put through once. Desmond Brennan walked into Ansel's office late that afternoon and shut the door harder than necessary. He asked Ansel whether he understood what he had just done. He said $400 million was gone. 3 seasons of negotiations with the Rothway family were gone. Both Pier 11 and Pier 12 would have to stop construction beginning the following week, and all of it had been traded for what? For an apology to a secretary whose name Desmond himself hadn't even been able to remember until 2 days ago. Ansel let him finish. Then he asked Desmond one question. If he had walked past that night and pretended he hadn't seen anything, how many people in this building would still believe this morning that there was anything here that couldn't be bought? Desmond couldn't answer right away. Ansel continued, his voice as low as it always was, saying that he hadn't done it because of Delia Hartwell. He had done it because if he'd stayed silent the night before, then today there would be another dozen people standing outside the gates of the hospital where her sister was being treated, and that was something he couldn't clean up with any amount of money. Desmond stood there for another moment, then left the room, and this time he closed the door very softly. Desmond came back to Ansel's office at nearly 7 o'clock that evening, when the entire floor had gone quiet. And this time, he didn't slam the door. He sat down and said he had spent the whole afternoon thinking, and still couldn't understand it. That there were things Ansel did that he didn't need to understand in order to follow. But this was different, because it hadn't looked like a decision. It had looked like anger. Ansel opened a drawer, took out a thin file, and placed it on the desk. He said what happened the night before hadn't been anger, and that he had already intended to end the engagement before he ever walked into that party. Desmond looked at the file, then at him. Ansel told him to turn to the last page, to the adjustment appendix of the guarantee agreement, the part no one on the board had bothered to read, because it was written in the kind of language that made people sleepy by the third line. Buried there was a clause stating that if Corsetti Group failed to meet the disbursement schedule for 2 consecutive periods, the right to appoint the operating company for every pier from Pier 7 onward would transfer to the guarantor. Not the right of repossession, not the right to collect a debt, the right to appoint the operator. Desmond read it twice, and the second time he set the papers down very slowly. Ansel said that at the current pace, Corsetti would miss the second disbursement target sometime near the end of winter, not because the business was failing, but because the guarantor itself controlled the disbursement schedule. In other words, they had sold him a rope and left him to tie the knot himself. Desmond asked who had found the clause. Ansel said Delia Hartwell had found it, and she had warned him 3 days before the party. She hadn't sent an email, hadn't left a note. She had waited until no one else was in his office, then knocked on the door, set the papers down, pointed to exactly 4 lines, and said that if he still chose to sign, she would never mention it to anyone again. Desmond was silent for a long time. Then he asked why Ansel hadn't said any of that the night before, right there in the dining room, in front of those 40 people, because all he would have had to do was hold up this file and the entire city would have understood why he was ending the engagement, and no one would have thought he had done it because of a secretary. Ansel said that if he'd done that, then the night before would have become a business matter, and people forgot business matters after a season. He wanted it to be something else. He wanted every person who had stood in that room to remember that there had once been an evening in Barrington when everything had stopped because of someone who had nothing at all. Desmond didn't argue another word. He picked up the file, said he would take it to legal first thing the next morning, then went home. Ansel left the building sometime after 8 o'clock. Outside the gate, pulled close to the curb, was an old unmarked car, and the woman inside didn't leave the driver's seat. She only lowered the window. She looked to be in her 40s, her hair tied neatly back, and she called his name before he could make out her face clearly. She introduced herself as Naomi Stroud, a federal agent, and said she had been sitting there since 3 o'clock that afternoon. Ansel didn't ask what she wanted. He simply stopped. Stroud said she hadn't come to arrest anyone, at least not yet, and that there was a file that had been sitting on her desk for years, a file in which every time she opened it, she found the Corsetti name beside another name, and that other name was the one she needed. She said she knew what had happened the night before in Barrington. She said the entire city believed he had just lost $400 million because of a dress, but she didn't believe that. Ansel asked what she wanted from him. Stroud said she wanted him to choose, and that he had until the end of that fall. After that, she wouldn't have the authority to decide where the file went anymore, and someone else would make that decision for her. She rolled the window back up and drove away without waiting for an answer. Ansel remained standing on the sidewalk for a long time, and for the first time that entire day, he didn't know what his next move was. Delia placed her resignation letter on Ansel's desk Thursday morning, before anyone on that floor had even had time to turn on the lights. She had written it 3 times during the night, and finally chosen the shortest version, exactly 4 lines, giving no reason, only asking to leave her position at the end of the month, and promising to complete a full handover. Ansel finished reading it and said nothing. He set the paper down, asked whether she had eaten breakfast, and when she said she wasn't hungry, He still stood up, poured her a cup of coffee, and placed it in front of her. Delia didn't touch it. She said the entire city was talking, that yesterday's newspaper was only the beginning, that as long as she remained in this building, people would keep having a reason to say he had ended his engagement because of a woman, and if that continued, the harbor project would die before they even lost the rest of the guarantee. She added that she didn't want to become anyone's excuse. Ansel listened to everything. Then he asked her one question. If he signed that letter, how was she going to pay her sister's hospital bills next month? Delia didn't answer. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. He continued, saying that he wasn't asking to make things harder for her. He was asking because in this entire building, she was the only person he had to ask that question, while everyone else had somewhere to fall. He picked up the resignation letter, folded it in half, and placed it in the drawer on his right, instead of signing it. He said he hadn't accepted it. Delia was about to say something, but he had already stood, walked to the window, and when he turned back, his voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a man trying to persuade her. It was the voice of a man assigning work. He said an inspection team would arrive before the end of that fall, and they would demand the corporation's complete archives from his father's time up to the present. Everything connected to the piers, contractor agreements, workplace accidents, and insurance records. He said the archive was stored in the basement of the old building by the harbor. No one had touched it in years, and not a single page had been digitized. Delia asked why he wasn't giving the job to the legal department. Ansel was quiet for a moment, then told her the truth. He said there were things in that archive that, if they fell into the wrong hands, wouldn't be only his problem, and he no longer knew who in this building still told him the truth. He said that 3 days before the party, she had carried a file into his office, pointed to 4 lines, then told him that if he still chose to sign, she would never mention it to anyone. He asked whether she knew why he remembered that. It wasn't because she had found the clause. It was because she had waited until no one else was in his office. Someone who wanted to use information to get something in return wouldn't have waited like that. Delia sat in silence for a very long time. Then she asked whether he understood that if she stayed, the rumors would only grow louder. Ansel said he understood. He said he had considered that all through the night, and he was still making the same choice, because between the two things he could lose, he would rather lose face before this city than lose the only person he still trusted. Delia stood. She said she would start Monday. He told her to start whenever she felt ready, and that he would have someone bring down a scanner, a table, and a decent chair, because the basement was cold. She thanked him, then walked out. At the door, she stopped and turned back. She said there was one thing he should know. She would read every page down there, because she didn't know how to work any other way, and if there was anything in that archive he didn't want anyone to read, there was still time for him to change his mind. Ansel looked at her and said he wasn't changing his mind. He said that if there was anything like that in the archive, then it was time someone read it. He said those words very quietly, almost as though they had slipped out before he could stop them, and he would remember them many times in the months that followed, each time with more pain than the last. The basement of the old building by the harbor smelled of damp paper and cold metal, and just as Ansel had said, it was cold down there. They had brought her a table, a scanner, a chair with a backrest, and a desk lamp that Delia had to prop up with 2 notebooks under its base before it stood high enough. She started with the outermost row of shelves, where the records were arranged by year, and she worked in the only way she knew how, which meant reading every page before scanning it, recording the reference number, sorting it, and only then placing it in the tray. By the end of the first week, she had made it through only 1 row. In the second week, she moved deeper into the storage area, where the cardboard boxes had no labels on the outside, only faded marker writing that had nearly disappeared, and in one box on the lowest shelf, she found an insurance file connected to a workplace accident at Pier 14. She recognized it before she even read the name. The date written in the upper right corner was something she would never need to look at twice to remember. It was the day her father died. Delia sat very still. Then she opened the file. Inside were the inspection report, the list of injured workers and fatalities, the family's claim for compensation, and at the very end, the response. The document was brief, stamped by an independent assessment firm, and in the conclusion there was a single sentence printed in bold, stating that the compensation claim lacked sufficient grounds because the cause of the incident had been determined to be operator error by the worker at the site. Beneath that sentence were the name of the assessment firm and the name of the person who had signed on its behalf. The assessment firm was Rothway Financial. Delia read the sentence 3 times. For the past 6 years, that had been the only thing she had ever been told about her father's death, and for all 6 of those years she had believed it, because it was written on stamped paper and because she had been only 21 at the time. Her mother had been ill, and no one in her family had possessed enough strength to ask even one more question. She closed the file, placed it on the right side of the table, and reached for the next box because she didn't know what else to do. The next box also contained insurance records, but from a different accident, at a different pier, more than a year after the one that had killed her father. She turned to the final page, the same document template, the same layout, and the same bold sentence about operator error by the worker at the site. The assessment firm was still the same name. Delia placed the second file on top of the first. Then she did something she would never be able to remember exactly when she had begun doing. She dragged every remaining box in that row onto the floor and opened them one by one, without scanning, without sorting, without recording reference numbers, only turning to the final page and reading that one sentence. She sat directly on the cold concrete floor among boxes with their lids thrown open, and each time she reached the last page, she added another file to the stack on her right. The stack kept growing. By the time she stopped, it had risen as high as her elbow. Not one case, not 2. A thick stack belonging to different families, names she had never heard before, years stretching across more than a decade, all of them seeking compensation, all of them denied, and every one of them denied with exactly the same sentence, word for word, right down to the comma. Delia understood something very clearly, something anyone who had ever worked with paperwork would understand, that when one sentence appeared unchanged across dozens of documents signed by different people at different times, it was no longer a conclusion. It was a template. Someone had built that template in advance, and every time someone died at this harbor, all they had to do was fill in the name. She sat among the open boxes until her hands had gone stiff with cold. Then she stood up, placed the stack of files into a separate box, taped a blank piece of white paper to the lid, and didn't write anything on it at all. At the bottom of that box, beneath the last layer of files, there was a flat plastic case about the size of her hand. Inside was a reel of magnetic tape, the kind used in the radio recording equipment for harbor dispatch, and beside it was a piece of paper folded into quarters. Delia opened the paper first. It was a receipt for the purchase of an archived recording, stamped by the Port Authority, with the tape identification number and the date of transfer clearly written on it. The transfer date was 11 days after her father died. On the line marked recipient there was a signature, and she recognized it because that same signature appeared on almost every old document in the archive. Gideon Corsetti. Delia picked up the tape and held it in her hand for a long time. There was an old tape player on the outermost shelf, the kind still used to check recordings before they were archived, and she had walked past it every day for 2 weeks without touching it once. She wiped the dust from its surface with her sleeve, plugged it in, and loaded the tape. The indicator light glowed orange. She pressed play. At first there was static, wind, and the voice of a dispatcher reading out a crew number. Then another voice cut in, and Delia reached out and touched the front of the machine. The voice said there was a crack in the eastern joint, directly beneath the base of the rig. The voice said, "Everyone down. Get down now. Don't stop to take anything." Then the voice said there was still one man up there. "I'm going up." After that came static, and the static continued until the end of the recording. The entire section containing his voice lasted 43 seconds. Delia pressed rewind. She listened from the beginning again. She listened through all 43 seconds, then pressed rewind once more. She listened again. She pressed rewind. She sat in the chair with the backrest that had been brought down for her, both hands resting on the table on either side of the machine, and listened again. She didn't write anything down. She didn't take out her phone. She pressed rewind. Sometimes she let the tape run past that part into the static, and she sat there listening to all of it before pressing rewind again. The indicator light on the machine flickered each time the tape ran backward. She pressed rewind. She pressed rewind. At some point, she placed both hands on the table, lowered her forehead onto them, and let the tape keep running. And when it reached the end, she lifted her head, reached out, and pressed rewind. The desk lamp propped up on 2 notebooks was still glowing. Outside the small window near the basement ceiling, the first light was beginning to turn from black to gray. Delia listened all the way through one more time. Then she switched off the machine, removed the tape, placed it back inside the plastic case, and laid the receipt on top. She sat there without moving until daylight had fully come. For 6 years, the only thing she had possessed from that morning was a bold sentence on an officially stamped piece of paper, saying that the worker at the site had made an operational error. For 6 years, she had carried that sentence everywhere with her. For 6 years, she hadn't allowed herself to question it, because questioning it wouldn't have changed anything, and because her family had too many other things to survive at the time. Now she knew who had first seen the crack. She knew who had ordered the entire crew to get down, and she knew why he hadn't come down with them. Delia stood, slipped the plastic case into her coat pocket, zipped it closed, then began putting every box lid that had been thrown open the night before back into its proper place, one by one, until the basement looked as though no one had ever touched anything there at all. The meeting took place in the old warehouse at the end of Allen's Road, where, since his father's time, a long wooden chair had stood in the middle of the floor, and no one was allowed to bring anything with them except the chair they intended to sit in. All 5 capos arrived. Desmond sat at the far end of the table, and for the first half hour he didn't say a word. He simply let each man speak in turn and empty out everything he had been holding in. The first talked about the 2 piers that had been forced to stop construction the week before, about the workers who were still waiting for jobs, and who wouldn't be waiting much longer because people from Fall River had already come over to speak with them. The second talked about contractors who had quietly stopped returning calls. The third talked about calls from City Hall that now took 3 days to be returned, when before they had taken only an afternoon. No one mentioned the party in Barrington. That was the part that mattered, because every one of them was talking about it without anyone giving it a name. Then Desmond finally spoke. He said there was a way to end all of this within 2 weeks, and it wasn't a new way. It had been used in this very room when Ansell's father still sat at the head of that table. He said Everett Rothway had more to lose than any of them, and a man with that much to lose was very easy to talk to, as long as someone sat down with him and spoke in a language he understood. Desmond didn't say anything more specific. No one in the room needed him to. Ansell asked exactly what Desmond was proposing, and he told him to say it out loud. Desmond was silent for a moment, then said he was proposing that they put Rothway back in his proper place. Ansell said no. One word, no explanation. And it was the lack of explanation that made the room grow hot. The oldest capo, a man who had followed Gideon since before this harbor had even become what it was, pushed his chair back and stood. He said he had been sitting at that table since before Ansell knew how to walk, that this place had been built through nights none of the young men now could even imagine, and now the son of the man who had built it intended to hold it together with what? Lawyers? Stacks of paper. He asked Ansell how he planned to protect the workers out there when Fall River had already come all the way over to speak to them in person. Ansell let him finish. Then he stood. He said his father had built this place through nights he himself had never spoken about to anyone, not even to his own son, and Ansell said he knew why his father had never told those stories. He said Gideon had done all those things not so they could preserve them, but so his son wouldn't have to live the same way he had lived. He said he was that design, the thing his father had spent an entire lifetime building toward, and if they broke him now, then they would also break the very reason they had followed his father all those years ago. No one answered immediately. The oldest capo stood there looking at him for a while, then picked up the coat hanging over the back of his chair. He said he had respected Ansell's father, and he said it in the past tense. Then he walked out. The second man stood and followed without saying a word. The third remained seated for another minute or so, staring down at the surface of the table. Then he too stood and left. The warehouse door closed 3 times. 2 men remained at the table, and neither of them dared look directly at Ansell. Desmond was the last to leave. Before he went, he stopped beside Ansell's chair and said that tonight Ansell had just lost half of them, and the half that remained wouldn't be enough to hold things together until spring. Ansell said he knew. Desmond asked whether he intended to change his mind. Ansell said no. Desmond gave a single nod, then walked out, and Ansell remained there alone beside that long wooden table until the first ship horn of the morning sounded outside. The report came in close to midnight, saying that Fall River's men had put up barricades at the entrance to Pier 7 and parked their vehicles across the main access road, and that Corsetti's night shift had been told to go home without anyone daring to argue. Ansell listened to everything, then asked who was in charge down there. The caller said Cormac Vance was there in person. Ansell told them not to call anyone else. He drove to the harbor alone, parked outside the barricade, and walked in. There were around 20 of Vance's men scattered across the yard, and when they recognized him, every one of them stopped. No one blocked his way. No one said a word. They only watched him pass. Cormac Vance was standing beside a shipping container near the edge of the yard, holding a paper cup of coffee. And when he saw Ansel, he laughed. He said the whole city had been saying 3 of Ansel's men had walked away, but now it looked like it wasn't 3 after all. It was everyone, because Ansel had come down here alone. Ansel said he had come alone because this matter only required 2 men. Vance asked what he thought he had left to negotiate, because from where Vance stood, Ansel had nothing left to put on the table. Ansel didn't answer. He reached inside his coat, took out a thin file, placed it on top of the container, pushed it toward Vance, then stepped back and stood still. Vance looked at the papers, then at him, and finally set his coffee down and opened the file. He turned the first page, then the second. His movements grew slower with every page, and when he reached the 4th, he stopped turning them altogether. The entire yard went silent. Ansel said those papers had been sitting in the safe at his house for 9 years. He said he had possessed them since before his father handed the business over to him. And in those 9 years there had been at least 4 occasions when he had every good reason to use them. And all 4 times, he hadn't. Vance asked why. Ansel said it was because Vance's mother was still alive. He said the old woman still lived in the same house on Bay Street, still attended Saturday evening mass, and still told people that her son worked in transportation. He said she had already buried 1 child many years ago, and he knew that, and he also knew the one day every year when she never left the house. Vance stood motionless, both hands still resting on the file. Ansel continued, his voice no louder than the water striking the stone embankment behind them. He said he hadn't come down there to threaten him, because both of them were past the age of threatening one another. He had only come to put the choice in front of him plainly. Vance could pull his men out of Pier 7 before sunrise, or those papers would go where they should have gone 9 years ago, and then the old woman on Bay Street would have to learn how to live with the fact that her second son wouldn't be coming home either, except this time she would have to live with it for 20 years instead of 1 morning. Vance said nothing for a very long time. He closed the file, pushed it back toward Ansel, and Ansel didn't take it. He told him to keep it because he had another copy, and he said it as calmly as he had spoken about Saturday evening mass. Vance watched him for another moment, then turned toward his men and gave a signal with 2 fingers. No one asked a question. They began taking down the barricades and backing their vehicles away from the main access road, and in less than half an hour, the entrance to Pier 7 was clear. Before getting into his car, Vance stopped beside Ansel and said his father wouldn't have done it this way. Ansel said he knew. Vance added that he wasn't sure Ansel's way was any better. Ansel said he wasn't sure either, and that was why he kept trying. Then he remained alone in the yard until the last Fall River vehicle disappeared through the gate. The following afternoon, Delia went upstairs to submit the index of the files she had scanned that week, and after knocking twice on Ansel's office door without receiving an answer, she pushed it open so she could leave the papers on his desk. He was standing by the window with his back to her, the phone pressed to his ear, and he didn't hear her come in. She was about to step back out when he began to speak, and she stopped. He told the person on the other end to go ahead if he wanted to, that he had no intention of stopping him. He said there was a loan in the name of the man's brother-in-law at a small bank outside Cranston, and that bank had changed ownership the week before, and the new owner had a habit of reviewing the entire portfolio during the first month. He said he wasn't the one doing the review. He was only telling him that someone would. Then he was silent for quite a while, listening to whatever was being said on the other end. And when he answered, his voice was just as quiet as it had been at the beginning, so quiet that Delia had to hold her breath to hear him clearly. He said the man had until Monday morning, and that he was saying it only once because he didn't like repeating himself. Then he ended the call. He turned around. He saw her standing there, and Delia took 1 step back. She didn't have time to think. Her foot moved before her mind could tell it not to, and the papers in her hand slipped slightly downward. The entire room fell silent for 1 very long beat. Ansel didn't move toward her. He didn't say that what she had heard wasn't what she thought it was. He didn't say the other man deserved it, even though he did. He simply remained where he was, keeping exactly the distance she had just created between them, and looked down at her hands gripping the papers tightly. Then he said that she had been right to step back. He said it calmly, without even the slightest trace of hurt in his voice, and that was precisely what left Delia with no idea how to answer. He went on to say that he would never blame her for taking that step backward, and that if there ever came a day when she stopped stepping back, he hoped it would be because she had seen him clearly, not because she had grown used to him. Delia placed the papers on the desk. She said that week's index was finished, and that she would complete the rest before the end of the month. He nodded. She walked out, and she walked very slowly, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want him to think she was running. All that evening, as she sat in the basement, she kept thinking about the fact that he hadn't explained a single thing. In her mind, she had already prepared every excuse a man like him might have offered, and he hadn't used any of them. The next morning, she went down to the archive earlier than usual. On her table, beside the scanner, sat an old tabletop tape player, the kind that had gone out of production long ago, its plastic casing yellowed with age, one corner marked by a long scratch, and its power cord neatly wrapped by someone with a cable tie. Beside it was a cardboard box containing 3 unopened blank tapes. There was no letter, no note, no sender's name. Delia stood looking at it for a long time. Then she plugged it in, switched it on to test it, and the indicator light on the front glowed orange, exactly like the machine in the archive. She turned it off. She pulled out the chair, sat down, placed both hands on the table on either side of the machine exactly as she had sat the night before, and remained that way for a while. Then she took the flat plastic case from her coat pocket, placed it beside the machine, and didn't open it. She began that day's work. She didn't go upstairs. She didn't say a single word of thanks to him either, and she understood that he hadn't been waiting for one. Delia began looking for them in the evenings after work, and she traveled by bus, because the names and addresses in the files were all in neighborhoods she knew well enough to find without a map. The first person shut the door before she could finish her second sentence. The second invited her inside, poured her a glass of water, listened to her speak for half an hour, then said she was old now and didn't want to spend the final year of her life sitting in some room where everything was being recorded. The third was a man named Warwick Pell, who repaired furnaces, and he was the only one who spoke to her plainly. He invited her to sit at the kitchen table, his hands still stained with machine oil, and he let her finish everything she had come to say. She placed a copy of the response sent to his family on the table, pointed to the bold sentence in the conclusion, then placed beside it a copy of the response sent to another family, from another peer, many years apart, with that exact same sentence, right down to every comma. He read both. He read them very carefully, and for one moment Delia thought she was finally about to have her first person. Then he pushed the 2 sheets back toward her and asked how old she was. She said 27. He asked whether she had children. She said no. He nodded as though he had just confirmed something, then told her to look around his kitchen. He said there were still 11 years left on the mortgage for this house. He said his wife worked the night shift at a warehouse, and she could probably guess who owned that warehouse, because in this city, everything beyond the harbor eventually belonged to one of 2 or 3 names. He said she had come to him with a briefcase full of papers and a good heart, and he believed her. He made a point of saying that he believed her. But what did she have to lose, while he had a house, a wife who worked nights, and 2 children still in school? He said that back then he had signed the paper accepting that conclusion, because they told him that if he signed, he would receive a small assistance payment, and if he didn't, then he could sue. But suing required a lawyer, and lawyers charged by the hour. He said he had signed it on a night when there was nothing left in his refrigerator. Then he asked her a question she would remember for a very long time. If he stood up now and told the whole story, and then nothing changed, no one suffered any consequences, nothing happened except that his wife lost her night shift job, would Delia be able to sit here with him on that day? Delia didn't lie to him. She said she couldn't promise that. Warwick Pell nodded, and he told her he respected her for not making a promise she couldn't keep. Then he walked her to the door. Over the next 3 weeks, she visited more than 20 other homes, and most of them answered her with different versions of that same sentence. Some refused her at the gate. Some listened to everything and then shook their heads. Some asked for her phone number and never called. By the end of the month, she had 8 people who agreed, and all 8 were people who, in the most literal sense, had nothing left to lose. People who had moved away from the city, people already past 70, people whose entire families had dwindled down until only they remained. The last person she went to see was a woman named Rosalind Kerr, who lived in a ground-floor apartment in Olneyville. She listened to Delia for no more than 10 minutes. She didn't read a single piece of paper. She only asked Delia for her full name. Delia told her. Rosalind Kerr sat silently for a moment, both hands resting in her lap, then said she agreed. And she said she had been waiting for this much longer than Delia could possibly imagine. Delia was about to ask what she meant by that, but it was already late. The last bus was about to leave, so she thanked her, wrote down her phone number, and went home. 9 people. Delia wrote the number in her notebook while sitting on the bus and underlined it twice. Rothway Financial issued a statement on a Tuesday morning, and the statement was less than half a page long. It said the bank regretted the personal incident that had occurred at a private gathering, that the conduct in question was entirely the personal responsibility of Priscilla Rothway and didn't reflect the values of the organization, and that Miss Rothway had voluntarily stepped down from every position she held on the board of directors, as well as from the charitable foundations sponsored by the bank. Everett Rothway didn't sign the statement. He let the communications department sign it. 3 days later, Priscilla was waiting for Delia across the street from the entrance to the old building by the harbor, at nearly 7 o'clock in the evening. She didn't get out of the car. She lowered the window and called Delia's name, and Delia stopped because she recognized the voice before she could clearly see the face. Priscilla said she needed to talk, and added that she wasn't going to apologize, so Delia wouldn't waste her time waiting for one. They sat in a small diner 2 blocks away, at the last table by the window, and Priscilla ordered nothing but water. She said that now, in this city, she was the woman who had slapped a secretary over a few drops of wine, that this was what people were writing, that this was what her friends were writing to one another in their messages, and that her father had allowed people to write it that way too. She said she had been pushed off the board with a single phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes. Delia asked what she wanted. Priscilla said she wanted Delia to know the truth, not for Delia's sake, but because she couldn't stand the thought of being remembered through the stupidest version of what had happened. Then she told her. She asked whether Delia had ever wondered why a woman like her would bother paying attention to an executive assistant. She said she had known whose daughter Delia was long before the party. She said her father had given her a name and a photograph taken from a personnel file, and he had told her that this woman couldn't be allowed to remain inside the Corsetti organization beyond that fall. Priscilla said she had asked him why, and he hadn't answered. He had only said there was an archive in the old building by the harbor, and that if this woman was still inside the organization when they started clearing out that archive, things would become very inconvenient. She said she hadn't asked anything else, because in her family no one ever asked anything else. Delia placed her hand flat on the tabletop and left it there. Priscilla continued. She said that night, when she saw Delia come in through the servants' entrance carrying a file folder, she knew she had very little time left, because Ansel was going to sign, and once he signed, she would lose the last excuse she had to interfere. She said she had around 10 minutes, roughly the time between Delia walking in and reaching the door again, to find some way to get that woman removed from the house and make sure she was never called back. She said she had planned to manufacture something, an accusation about missing documents, something clean, something with witnesses, enough to force human resources to open a disciplinary file. Then the tray struck Delia's elbow, a few drops of wine spilled, and in that exact moment Priscilla panicked, and she chose the stupidest possible option out of all the choices she could have made. Priscilla said it hadn't been anger. She said she almost wished it had been anger, because then she might have felt better about it. She said she had done something filthy for her father, with the mind of someone in a panic, and now her father had come away clean while she had been left like this. She said all of it in the voice of someone feeling sorry for herself, not the voice of someone who was sorry. Delia asked her only one question. What was her father afraid of in that archive? Priscilla looked out the window for a long time, then said she didn't know, and that if she did know, she would have something to bargain with now. She stood, left a bill on the table for the glass of water she hadn't touched, and walked out. Delia called the Corsetti house the next morning and asked to see Gideon. Margot Doyle was the one who opened the door, and she led Delia upstairs to the study on the second floor, without asking why she had come. Gideon Corsetti was sitting in the chair beside the window, a thin blanket draped over his legs, and he didn't look surprised to see her. Delia placed the flat plastic case on the small table between them, opened the lid, and laid the receipt on top of the tape. She said nothing. Gideon looked at the paper for a long time. Then he said he had been waiting for this for a very long time, and he said it like a man finally setting down something heavy he had been carrying since morning. He told her to sit. He said the signature on the receipt was indeed his. He said he was the one who had gone to the Port Authority, signed the register, and brought that tape back. Then he told her the part Delia hadn't been prepared to hear. He said the money used to buy it hadn't been his. Delia asked him what he meant. Gideon said the person who had paid for that tape was Walter Hartwell. He said her father had come to see him one evening, carrying an envelope, and inside that envelope was every dollar a dock worker had managed to save over many years, not a single bill missing, all of it laid flat and neat the way people arrange important documents. He said her father had placed the envelope on the table and told him he needed to purchase an archived recording, but a man like him couldn't buy one because the Port Authority would sell only to a registered legal entity, and because if he went there himself, someone would know what he was doing before the afternoon was over. Gideon paused for a very long time at that point. Then he said her father had known. He said Walter had discovered the problem at the Eastern Joint some time before, had reported it twice through official channels, and both times had been told that the engineering department had inspected it, and everything remained within acceptable limits. He said her father hadn't believed those acceptable limits, so he began documenting everything himself, and he wanted the radio recordings from earlier shifts to prove that the warnings had been coming in for a long time, not just since the day before. He intended to bring all of it forward at once when he had enough. He never got the chance. Delia sat perfectly still. She looked at the tape lying inside the case and understood something she had never known until that moment. Gideon hadn't buried the truth to destroy it. He had archived her father's final seconds using the very authority Walter had lacked, waiting for the day someone would have the courage to play it. Circumstances had simply spiraled beyond his control. Gideon continued. He said 2 weeks after that evening, the accident happened at Pier 14, and he had sat in this very room with the empty envelope on the table and hadn't known what to do. He said he had taken the tape to his private attorney, and they had told him that the recording alone wasn't enough, that it proved someone had discovered the crack and ordered the crew to evacuate, but it didn't prove who had pressured whom into signing the inspection report beforehand, and that if he released it by itself, the only thing it would expose would be Gideon himself. Delia asked why he hadn't taken it to the police. Gideon looked at her and said it was because her father had told him not to. He said that evening, before leaving, Walter had said one thing to him, and Gideon had remembered every word of it for 6 years. Her father had said that if anything happened to him, Gideon wasn't to take this to the police station, because in this city, everything taken to the police eventually found its way back to exactly where it had started. He had told Gideon to keep it and wait. Wait until there was someone who wasn't afraid of losing anything. Then give it to that person. Gideon said he had waited. He said he had thought of dozens of people over those 6 years. Journalists, attorneys, several people at City Hall. And every time he thought of someone, he realized that person still had something to lose. He said there had been nights when he had almost taken the tape out and burned it. He said he had also considered giving it to his son, and he hadn't, because Ansel had an entire organization to lose, and because Gideon knew that the first thing his son would see in that stack of files wouldn't be Rothway. Delia didn't ask what he meant by that. Gideon told her the last part. He said that when her job application had landed on his desk years earlier, he had recognized the last name immediately, and he had hired her not out of pity, but because he was a coward, because he wanted to look every day at the price of his own silence. He said he had never imagined that the person Walter had spoken of, the one who wouldn't be afraid of losing anything, would turn out to be Walter's own daughter. Delia remained in that room for a long time after he finished speaking. She didn't cry out loud. She only reached over and closed the lid of the plastic case very slowly, then left her hand resting on top of it. Naomi Stroud was waiting for her at the bus stop, not inside her car this time, but standing beneath the shelter with a brown paper envelope in her hand. She said she had been following Delia for 3 weeks, and she said it not to frighten her, but so Delia would understand that she knew who those 9 names were. Delia asked what she wanted. Stroud said she wanted Delia to testify at a hearing before the State Insurance Commission, and she said the time remaining was measured in weeks, not months, because when that fall ended, the case file would leave her hands, and someone else would decide where it went. Delia said she would think about it. Stroud held out the envelope and said perhaps she should read this before she thought. Inside was a copy of a structural safety inspection report, prepared not long before the accident at Pier 14, taken from the records of a state regulatory agency, which meant it was a copy no one inside the Corsetti organization could have touched or altered. Delia read it from top to bottom. In the conclusion, there was exactly 1 line confirming that the structure met requirements and that construction was permitted to continue. In the lower right corner was the inspection company field, and inside it were the seal and full name of Corsetti Construction, along with an abbreviated signature made up of 3 letters. Stroud said she had given Delia this copy, and not another, because she wanted Delia to understand exactly where she stood. Then she walked away and left her there holding the paper. Delia went up to the building that evening. Ansel was still in his office. She didn't knock. She placed the paper on his desk, turned it so he could read it, and said she needed to hear him say it, not explain it. Ansel looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. He didn't ask where she had gotten it. He sat in silence for a long time, and when he finally spoke, the first thing he said was that he had known. Delia remained where she was. He said he had known about that report since the year he took over the business, that he had found it while reviewing the corporation's entire legal archive, and that he had sat staring at the 3 letters in the lower right corner exactly the way she was staring at them now. He said those 3 letters were the abbreviated signature his father had used on internal documents for decades, and he had recognized it immediately. Delia asked what he had done afterward. Ansel said he had done nothing. He said he had put the paper back exactly where he found it, and hadn't opened it again once in 6 years. He said he had told himself it was already over, that insurance had taken care of the compensation, that dragging a document like that into the light wouldn't save anyone anymore. Then, he told her the truth. He said the only reason he hadn't brought it forward was because if he did, the man who would go to prison would be his father. He said his father was 73 years old, and he had chosen to let a piece of paper remain untouched in a drawer, rather than watch his father leave the house in Barrington through the back door. After saying it, he didn't add anything to make it sound easier. Delia asked whether he knew whose name was in the denied compensation file, whether he knew what that inspection report had led to. Ansel said he didn't. He said he had never read the insurance files, had never known how many families were in them, and had never known her father was among them until this very moment. Then he said that not knowing didn't make him any less responsible, because he had had 6 years to know, and he had spent all 6 of them making sure he didn't. Delia asked why he had given the archive to her. Ansel was silent for a very long time before answering that. Then he said perhaps it was because he was tired. He said he hadn't been hiding anything from her. He said for 6 years, the only person he had been hiding from was himself, and when he handed the archive keys to the one person he knew would read every page, perhaps somewhere deep inside he had wanted someone to drag that paper into the light for him, because he couldn't bring himself to do it. He said he wasn't asking her to forgive him for that. Delia picked up the paper, folded it, and slipped it into her coat pocket. She said she needed some time. He nodded. She walked out, and he didn't call her back. Delia didn't return to the old building by the harbor at all during the following week. She sent back the entire index of scanned records through internal mail, along with a short note explaining which sections were finished and which were still incomplete, and she didn't write a single word beyond what the work required. Every day she thought about the paper in her coat pocket, and every day she placed it beside something else in her mind, beside the old tape player on her desk, beside the sentence he had spoken when he told her she had been right to step back, beside the fact that he had handed the archive keys to the one person he knew would read every page. She didn't know how any of those things were supposed to fit together. Then, on Thursday night, Junie's condition suddenly worsened. The ambulance arrived before Delia even had time to change her clothes, and she followed her sister to the hospital at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning with her coat on backward. They took Junie inside and told Delia to wait in the hallway. That hallway had a row of connected blue plastic chairs, a vending machine in the corner, and a clock on the wall whose second hand could be heard with startling clarity. Delia sat in the third chair from the end. She didn't call anyone, because there was no one left for her to call. Close to 3 o'clock in the morning, she heard footsteps at the far end of the hallway. Ansel walked toward her alone, his coat draped over one arm. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask whether she needed anything. He simply sat down 2 seats away from her, placed his coat across his lap, and remained silent. Delia asked who had told him. He said the hospital had called the office because his name was listed in the records as the guarantor for the medical bills, and he added that she shouldn't worry. He hadn't interfered with anything. He had only listened and come here. She started to say something about the hospital expenses. He spoke first and told her not to talk about money tonight. After that, neither of them said anything. At one point, close to 4 o'clock, a nurse walked past and asked whether he was family, and he said no. He was only waiting. The nurse looked at him for another second before continuing down the hallway, and Delia realized that here, dressed the way he was, at this hour of the morning, no one knew who he was, and he wasn't doing anything to make them know. He didn't call anyone. He didn't ask for Junie to be moved to another room. He didn't ask for the name of the doctor on duty. The man who could make an entire city wait 3 days for a returned phone call sat on that blue plastic chair for 4 hours and couldn't do a single useful thing. And he knew it. And he stayed anyway. At one point he stood, bought 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine, handed one to her, then sat back down in exactly the same place. She held that cup in both hands until it went cold. Around 6 o'clock in the morning, they finally allowed her inside. Junie was awake and exhausted. But when she saw her sister, she managed to lift one hand slightly. Delia sat on the edge of the bed and told her to go back to sleep, that she was here now. Junie asked whether Delia had been sitting outside all night. Delia said yes. Junie asked whether anyone had been sitting with her. Delia was silent for a moment, then said yes. Junie closed her eyes for a while, and Delia thought she had fallen asleep. Then she opened them again and told her sister that she remembered the night Delia had reheated soup for her, the night Junie had asked whether she ever got tired of having to be the strong one, and Delia had gone into the kitchen and never come back with an answer. Delia said she remembered. Junie said she didn't need an answer anymore. She said Delia didn't have to be the strong one tonight, because this time someone had been sitting out there, and it was the first time in her life she had ever seen her sister waiting while someone waited with her. Delia couldn't say a word. She bent down, reached out, and gently stroked her sister's hair, and she stayed that way for a very long time. By the time she stepped back into the hallway, daylight had come. The 5th blue plastic chair from the end was empty. His coat was folded neatly on the seat, and there was no note with it. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, and on Thursday night Delia returned to the old building by the harbor to turn in her access card and collect the last few things she had left in the basement. She went down there at nearly 9 o'clock in the evening. She packed the scanner back into its box, unplugged the desk lamp, and stood for quite a while in front of the old tape player on the table before deciding to leave it there. She was coiling the cord when she smelled it. It wasn't the smell of burning paper, but the sharp, sweet smell of oil, and it was coming from the direction of the stairs. By the time she reached the foot of the staircase, smoke was already pouring down the steps, thick and low, and the door at the top of the stairs was closed. Delia turned back, pulled her collar over her nose, and did one thing before she did anything else. She ran to the innermost shelf and grabbed the box with the blank white paper taped to its lid. She held it against her chest and went back up the stairs. The door wouldn't open. Outside, Ansel arrived at that exact moment. He had driven down to the harbor because Margot had called him and said Delia was still down there alone, and when he reached the yard, he saw 2 things at once: smoke curling out through the small window near ground level, and Desmond Brennan standing about 20 steps from the building, both hands in his pockets, staring straight at it. Ansel ran past him without stopping. He yanked at the door, kicked the brace loose, and went down into the smoke calling her name. He found her at the turn in the staircase, and she was still holding the box. He told her to drop it. She shook her head. He wrapped an arm around her and pulled her up one step at a time, and she kept holding the box until they reached the doorway. Only then did she let go, and the box fell onto the steps. Its lid sprang open, and papers spilled across the concrete floor. They made it outside. The fire department arrived about 10 minutes later, and the fire was brought under control before midnight. No one was hurt. There was nothing left in the basement. Desmond remained standing in the same place from beginning to end, and he didn't run when he saw Ansel walking toward him. Ansel didn't hit him. He only asked whether he had known Delia was still down there. Desmond said no. He said he had stood outside watching for the entire hour before that, and had counted everyone who came out of the building, and he had been certain there was no one left inside. Then he said one more thing, and it was the only thing he said to explain all of it. He said Everett Rothway was holding a set of files strong enough to send Gideon Corsetti to prison for the rest of his life, and that out of the 2 people he could save, he had chosen the old man. Ansel didn't answer. He stood looking at him for a very long time, then turned away, and that was the last time the 2 of them ever spoke. Margot Doyle arrived at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning carrying a briefcase and a cloth bag. She told Delia that she had worked in that house for more than 30 years, that she knew what the house was hiding, and she also knew what inside it could disappear, and that 2 weeks earlier she had quietly photocopied every document Delia had separated into that box and stored the copies in the safe at the Corsetti house. Delia opened the case. It was all there. She sat down on the steps with the stack of papers in her lap, and Stroud, who had arrived just after the fire department, sat beside her and turned through several pages. Then she said what both women had already known before it was spoken aloud. She said these were copies. She said that without the originals for comparison, without original seals, without any chain of custody proving how those documents had left the archive and whose hands they had passed through. The commission wouldn't accept them. She said she could argue about it all morning and she would lose. Delia asked what about the tape. Stroud said the tape was even worse, because it was a recording that had been purchased years earlier, without any formal evidence sealing record, and the other side would need only one sentence to cast doubt on it. Delia folded the stack of papers together and placed it on the step beside her. There were still more than 5 hours before daylight. That same night, at the house in Barrington, Gideon Corsetti suffered a stroke and was rushed to the hospital before dawn, and by the time Ansel arrived, his father could no longer speak. The hearing room of the State Insurance Commission was on the second floor of an old administrative building, and that Friday morning it was more crowded than usual. Delia walked in with empty hands. She had left the stack of photocopies at home. She carried no briefcase, no tape, nothing the other side could stand up and question the origin of. The attorneys for Rothway Financial sat in the row on the right, 3 of them, with thick files arranged in neat stacks in front of them. Everett Rothway sat behind them. The chair called Delia's name and asked whether she had any documents she wished to submit. Delia said no. He asked again to make certain. She said no. One of the 3 attorneys on the other side smiled and bent down to write something. The chair invited her to speak. Delia stood. She didn't talk about her father. She didn't talk about the night in Barrington. Didn't talk about the basement. Didn't talk about what had burned the night before. She said she was asking only to read a list, and she asked permission to read it slowly. Then she read the first name. In the last row of the room, a man well into his 70s braced one hand against the arm of his chair and stood. He didn't say anything. He simply stood. Delia read the second name. A woman in the middle row rose to her feet. She read the third name, and somewhere in the left corner came the sound of a chair scraping backward. The entire room began turning around. She read the fourth name, then the fifth, and each time she finished, another person stood, and not one of them said a single word, and their silence carried more weight than anything they could have said. By the 6th name, one of the attorneys on the other side stood and objected, saying this wasn't evidence. The chair struck the gavel once and told him to sit down. Delia continued with the 7th name. She read the 8th, then she read the final name, and Rosalind Kerr stood from the second row. 9 people were standing in that room, facing the chair's table, and not one of them sat back down. Delia said only one thing after that. She said that all of these families had received the same response, written in the same language, signed by the same organization, across more than a decade, and she asked the commission to put just one question to the other side. How could events so different from one another have produced conclusions identical down to every comma? Then she sat down. The chair called Naomi Stroud. She stepped forward, placed her badge on the table, and said she wasn't there as a witness for either side. She said that many years earlier, an inspector had been asked to sign another man's name to a report for a survey he hadn't performed, and he had signed it, and he had lived with that signature until he wasn't alive anymore. She said that man was her father. She said she had followed this case for 6 years not because she wanted to arrest anyone, but because she wanted one day to stand in a room like this and say that his name didn't belong there. Then she submitted the index of inspection reports preserved by the state regulatory agency, originals bearing official seals, including the Pier 14 report in the name of Corsetti Construction. The chair asked whether anyone from Corsetti Group was present. Ansel stood from the very last row. He had been sitting there since the beginning of the hearing without anyone noticing him. He walked forward, and before he spoke, he looked at Delia for exactly 1 second. Then he testified. He testified that he had known about that report for many years. He testified that he hadn't brought it forward. He testified that under the corporation's internal procedures at the time, every inspection report had to pass through the guarantor's review department before it could receive a seal, and he submitted the complete document routing logs, still preserved on the company's servers, the only records that hadn't been stored in the basement that burned. The chair asked whether he understood that his testimony could lead to criminal liability for the person who had signed the report. Ansel said he understood that very clearly, and he said his father was lying in a hospital across the city, and that if he woke up, Ansel would tell him about this himself. After the hearing, Everett Rothway left the building through a side entrance. Within 1 week, the commission referred the entire case to investigators. Before that fall ended, Rothway Financial was suspended from performing independent assessment work, and Everett Rothway resigned from every position he had ever held in that city. The call from the transplant center came on a Wednesday afternoon, and they told Delia that a compatible living donor had been found for Junie, that the entire evaluation process had already been completed, and that the surgery could be scheduled within 3 weeks. Delia asked them to repeat it twice because she couldn't believe she had heard correctly. The person on the other end read the information again, then said the donor had registered 8 months earlier, had completed every round of compatibility testing, had been interviewed twice by the ethics committee, and had requested that the recipient's family not be informed until the final results were confirmed. Delia asked for the name. She was told that, according to the donor's wishes, that was something the woman herself had to tell her. The following afternoon, Rosalind Kerr opened the door of her ground-floor apartment in Olneyville and invited Delia inside, and she didn't look surprised at all. Delia stood in the middle of the room and asked her why. Rosalind told her to sit down first. Then she said there was something she hadn't finished telling Delia on the night Delia had come to see her, something she had intended to say, but Delia had been rushing to catch the last bus, so Rosalind had kept it for another time. She said her husband's name was Emmett Kerr, and he had been at Pier 14 that morning. She said he was one of the men who made it down. Then she told Delia the part she had never heard from anyone. She said her husband had told her that when everyone began evacuating, he turned back to get his tool bag from the corner of the floor, because there were several things inside it that he had saved a long time to buy, and that a man had grabbed him by the shoulder and shoved him toward the stairs, shoved him so hard that he stumbled down several steps and scraped one entire side of his arm. She said the tool bag stayed up there. Her husband came home. She said he told that story exactly once, that very night, and never told it again in all the years that followed, and she never asked because one look at his face had told her enough. She said he died 3 years ago from illness, at home, and during his final months he often spoke about the man who had pushed him out. Rosalind said that after Delia left this apartment that evening, she had sat there for a very long time. Then she said the thing Delia hadn't been prepared to hear. She said she had known whose daughter Delia was long before that night. She said she had known since the previous winter, when she happened to read an article about a charitable organization raising money for young dialysis patients, and Junie Hartwell's name had appeared on the list, and Rosalind had sat staring at that last name for the entire evening. She said she had gone to register the very next week. She said she hadn't told anyone, not even her 2 children, until she passed the final stage, because she was afraid that if she wasn't compatible, she would have to live with that knowledge. Delia asked why she hadn't said anything on the night she agreed to testify. Rosalind said that if she had told her then, Delia would have thought she was agreeing because of a debt, and Rosalind hadn't wanted the 2 things tangled together. Then she said that for 3 years she had carried a debt to a man who was no longer alive, and she hadn't known who she could repay it to, and now she did. Delia couldn't say anything. She sat in that chair for a very long time, and Rosalind Kerr simply poured her another glass of water and let her sit. That same week, Gideon Corsetti regained consciousness. He couldn't say much, and one side of his face still wouldn't obey him. Ansel sat beside the bed and told his father everything that had happened at the hearing, including his own testimony, including the part where he submitted the document routing logs, including what all of it could mean for Gideon himself. He told him everything, without leaving out a single word, then sat in silence and waited. Gideon looked at his son for a long time. His right hand moved slightly against the blanket. Then he opened his mouth and managed 2 words, distorted and hoarse, so faint that anyone else would have had to listen very carefully to understand them. But Ansel understood immediately. Well done. 1 year later, in a row of low buildings at the beginning of the road leading into the harbor district, there was a small office open from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening, charging no fees and specializing in legal guidance for dock workers and their families on workplace accident claims, insurance, and compensation. On the wooden sign hanging outside the door was one name, Walter Hartwell, and beneath it there was no explanation at all, because Delia didn't want to have to explain it to anyone. She worked there in the mornings and completed her final year of law school in the evenings. Junie had recovered by spring, had started working part-time at a bookstore, and still stopped by the office from time to sit at the front desk and help her sister receive people who came in with questions. Rosalind Kerr came on Saturday afternoons, sat in the corner of the room, and she was the only person allowed to make coffee there. Warwick Pell, the furnace repairman who had turned Delia down in his kitchen the year before, had come too. He didn't say much. He simply handed her a stack of old papers and said that this time he would sign. The backyard of the office opened onto a vacant lot, where several dockworker families in the neighborhood still let their children play on weekends. And that Saturday afternoon, while Delia sat in the meeting room, reviewing a case file, the sound of children chasing one another drifted in through the open window, their laughter bright and clear, cutting through the conversations of adults before fading away again. Ansel sat across from her, and he had been quiet for some time. He had come to bring her the list of peers scheduled for review in the next quarter, but the papers had been lying on the table for half an hour, and neither of them had opened them. Then he spoke. He said he hadn't brought a ring, and he didn't intend to bring one, because he thought that if he gave her a ring, she would have to look at it while deciding, and he wanted her to look directly at him. He said he couldn't give her a clean family name. He said his name carried things he couldn't wash away, and he would have to answer for them for many years to come, and there would be mornings when she opened the newspaper and saw that name there. Then he told her the only thing he could promise. He said he would be the last person in his family line who ever had to apologize for that name. He said he wasn't asking her to trust him immediately. He was only asking her to give him room to prove it. Delia didn't answer right away. She looked out toward the backyard, where the children's laughter had faded and then risen again, and she thought about an evening in Barrington, when she had walked to the bus stop with a file folder held against her chest, believing that her life would always be nothing more than calculations about how to survive the following month. Then she turned back and looked at him. She said she didn't need a clean family name. She said she had grown up in a home where the only thing hanging on the wall was a brass employee badge, and she had learned that people weren't remembered for their last names. They were remembered for what they did in the final 43 seconds of their lives. She said she was staying. She said she had been staying ever since the day she took one step backward, and he hadn't said a single thing to pull her back. Outside, the children kept running around the yard, and no one in the meeting room bothered to close the window. The story ends there, and what remains is very simple. A person's hand may strike your face, but it never has the right to define who you are. Human dignity doesn't live in the title printed on the badge pinned to your chest, in the dress someone wears, or in the door they are permitted to enter. It lives in how we treat the person who has nothing in their hands, and in whether we have the courage to stop when continuing forward would be so much easier. There are acts of kindness that move quietly through the years without the person receiving them ever knowing, like a father who pushed his coworker to safety first, and many years later, that coworker's wife quietly saved his daughter. Life still has its own way of being fair. It simply moves more slowly than we wish it would. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it so that every day we can continue listening together to stories that are truly worth hearing. How did this story make you feel? And was there anything in it that reminded you of someone in your own life? Please leave a few words in the comments, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.